Hello again. 7 weeks into this war of good versus rancid evil, and I don't count laughable and unrealistic ceases fire, I can readily say that I'm surprised it still endures. I would have thought that by now Iran would have fallen or certainly surrendered, and although the US and Israel may have struck a significant blow to the enemy from which it won't soon recover, I'm afraid both may very soon retreat, and frankly, in this case, retreat is a loss, the retreat reason being irrelevant. For two of the world's most powerful armies, special forces, intelligence, and air forces, to stand down from a far inferior opponent after an only semi successful 7 week campaign is at best shameful. At worst, we should be frightened beyond words of what this means for the future. It is laughable that Hegseth and Katz and all their great advisors and strategists didn't contemplate the what if Strait of Hormuz. Rather, they're behaving like deer in the headlights. So now Iran doesn't only hold 80 million of its own people hostage, it holds 8 billion. Frankly, anything short of US and Israel endorsed regime change is a failure. And negotiations failing time and again should come as no surprise. In its continual excelling practice of Einstein's insanity definition, Israel has been dealing with this very same vile strain for 80 years, not only to no avail, but rather to its severe detriment and demise. That said, I should make honorable mention of God. In this case, He dispatched a large part of the cure before the ailment. Why Russia is and has been completely preoccupied with Ukraine the past 4 years, which in and of itself is stunning, like Iran, and therefore is likely depleted of both resources and recourses. Conversely, China is more focused on Taiwan or whatever, and wishes not to prematurely deplete resources in someone else's fight. Of course, I'm mindful that the story or saga is yet to be fully written. Nonetheless, I figured such poetic justice and clearly godly intervention deserved mention. Regardless of how things ultimately materialize, I'm not terribly optimistic about the future of the globe. You probably already gathered that from my previous podcasts. The prognosis is mostly bitter. Even if Iran returns to its glory days pre-revolution, 1979, that's merely a microcosmic fix in an otherwise frighteningly pathetic world. Perhaps because the good seem to have the tendency to wake up too late, and or because that's simply God's will, likely a little of both. Today's world is too dominated by tyrants, skanks, marauders, dictators, villains, and the most putrid scum, to which list all universities across this once great nation have been added, to successfully wind back the clock. It's merely a matter of time. Rather, I fear my timing is impeccable in my prognostication 25 years ago that by the year 2040 there will be no America, which by extension means no world. And so, even though I feel for the wonderful Persian people who were taken hostage 45 years ago by the bastard and his henchmen, the US and Israel coming in to save the day, whether for their own selfish reasons and or altruistically for the Iranian people or both, is like fixing a pinhole flat in a tire that's been shredded off its wheel. And I should emphasize that unlike the Palestinians, who I do not trust and therefore most in Gaza and the West Bank do not evoke my pity, the Iranian people do, because they are overwhelmingly a truly good people with a rich and glorious, not death and wretched, culture and history. Formerly iconic syndicated radio talk show host, the late great Bob Grant, said it best 30 years ago, quote, America will most definitely fall just like many mighty empires before her. The only unique feature this time, however, is that all others before us fell from the enemy without, whereas we will fall from the enemy within, unquote. 30 years later, I can readily say that although we may fall because of both enemies, within and without, there's no doubt that Bob was on the money in that the enemy within will have played the bigger role in our demise as it plays out in real time as I do this podcast. To hammer home this idea, I will insert the late great Paul Harvey's 1965 If I Were the Devil bit in the description box below. And AI isn't helping either. Yes, I'm aware of the great benefits that we may derive therefrom, but simultaneously it will wreak disaster upon mankind and is overwhelmingly frightening. I assure you this is not a false positive Y2K paranoia, this one's real. Although I should add that Y2K fears certainly did materialize, this watershed moment did in fact play out. For while no worldwide computer glitch, as was feared, played out, something far more sinister did. Y2K marked the beginning of the end of innocence, common decency, common sense, integrity, and chivalry, and the beginning of insanity, acrimony, of deprecation, deprivation, promiscuity, unabashed immorality, and unhinged, grotesque random violence, psychopathic and sociopathic menaces, and their mass murder of thousands of innocent children, as well as paraphilia, sedition, and salacious behavior, anti-Semitism, anti-whiteism, anti-Westism, and dare I say, even anti-selfism. And they're all interdependent. And while it was all set in motion years earlier, Y2K prompted a sudden sharp acceleration. And you wonder why we are where we are, why perdition is no doubt our fate. Don't you clearly see God's meticulous woven plan? He says, you behave like it, turds, I'll treat you like one. But I digress. While I will not say much more on the AI topic, no doubt its consequences are far beyond the realm of what civilization can even fathom today. It will in due time unleash worldwide epic fury. You see what I did there? You thought that term in the title of this podcast was related to the opening salvo regarding the Iran war. AI coupled with the Iran war and Gaza scrimmage will be the primary, if not exclusive, catalyst in the next Holocaust, which is now inevitable. And while anti-Semitism existed pre-October 7th, post, it has reached its zenith or very near. I highly encourage all my viewers or listeners to read famed journalist and editor Alistair Heath's article in the Sun Telegraph, July 2025. I will insert the links to both the written article as well as the AI, there you go again, audio version in the description box below. In 3 minutes, he says what I've been saying over 12 podcasts and a book. As an aside, or maybe not so aside, I always found it rather perplexing that those who subscribe to supersessionism, better known as replacement theology, in other words, still abide by Vatican I pre-John 23's Nostra Aetate of 1959, like Owens, Carlson, Gibson, Bilzerian, Prigent, to name a few, are more virulent in their anti-Semitism than those who do subscribe to John 23. The reason for my perplexion is as follows. Isn't Vatican I all about replacement of the Jewish people as God's chosen? And that due to the Jews' grave sin in rejecting Jesus as Lord and Savior, God has now turned against them and has instead adopted those who have placed their trust and fealty in his so-called Son, namely Christians, and more particularly Catholics? If that is in fact the case, and if the Catholic Church, one, in fact believes this balderdash, why the animus? We Jews ought to now be rendered moot, irrelevant, and insignificant. Logic dictates that only the post-John 23 school should take issue with the Jews, as we are technically not replaced and are still chosen, perhaps alongside the Christian believer. After all, in such latter case, there's at least a modicum of competition. I get that. But here's the truth. The Vatican I school doesn't really believe that it supersedes anything or that it replaced anyone, least of all the Jews. And that would be a source of great antipathy. The world over knows well that the Jews have been, are, and will always be God's chosen, and thus the reason for abject anti-Semitism. Teacher's pet will always be Bane. Another example of foolish hoodwinking is this. The late great atheist, polemicist, and New York Times best-selling author Christopher Hitchens proffers that a lot, or even most, murder and mayhem over the years was caused or even directly perpetrated by the so-called God-fearing and believing. I, however, maintain he is severely mistaken. Far greater evil has been perpetrated by non-believers. It's ironically hilarious to me that while beginning with the Industrial Revolution, the past 150 years saw the most amazing technological advancements and progress, it has been the quintessence of regress. And while Hitchens has responded to such criticism with, quote, perhaps so, but never in the name of atheism. Atheism doesn't kill in the name of a deity. First, whether atheism kills in the name of X or not is irrelevant. The only fact that is integral is that it kills, period. Second, what you, Mr. Hitchens, consider believers are liars, deceivers, and subterfuge artists. You claim Hitler was God-fearing or at least believing because on all Nazi or at least SS uniform belt buckles was inscribed the 3 words, Gott mit uns, God is with us. I'm disappointed, Chris. You mean Hitler even hoodwinked a wise fellow like yourself? And not because he yelled God from the Brattis or Oriel, but because of some Nazi sartorial insignia? 2,000 years ago, the Talmud related, Ganva pumachtarta rachmanakarya. A thief while engaged in his theft calls upon the Lord that he succeed. We even have a real-life example of this, why in 300 AD, Roman Emperor Constantine suddenly, laughingly, became a penitent, and not only received and accepted Christianity, but made it Rome's dominant sovereign religion. However, all good intelligent people know that it was not because he suddenly had a change of heart and became one of the faithful. Rather, Constantine did so because it was politically expedient. He embraced the old axiom, if you can't beat him, join him, and he was ultimately proven wildly correct, as he is the father of commingling of church and state, and it worked like a charm for nearly 1600 years, mutually benefiting the respective beneficiaries with each's respective nefarious end. It was a successful ploy because the idea of God is so powerful and impactful and allows for serious galvanization of the masses. How many throughout the ages have abused the God idea, i.e., sacred means, for its selfish, ugly ends? Jim Jones, David Koresh, Marshall Applewhite, just to name a few. While the Crusades, let's count that one religious fundamentalist, is responsible for 4 to 6 million deaths, of which most were enemy combatants during war fighting for conquest. For example, only 2,000 Jews total were murdered during the entire Crusade saga. And while I don't mean to make light of 2,000 lives, it is intended to put numbers in context, as you will shortly see. And while the Spanish Inquisition, let's count this one as well as religious fundamentalists, is responsible for approximately 14,000 Jewish deaths, Stalin, Mao, Hitler, and Pol Pot, all proud non-believers, if not outright atheists, combined, in a mere 60 years, murdered over 100 million, of which more than half were not enemy combatants, and land conquest per se, at least in the case of 3/4, was not the stated or intended end either. In most cases, it was murder simply for the sake of murder and nothing more. Of course, always couched in terms of politics or policies. For example, famine in Cambodia, etc. Not unlike quisling coward anti-Semites nowadays hiding under the cover of anti-Zionism or Israelism. So easy, so cheesy, the reason the term Free Palestine is the most alarmingly offensive anti-Semitic slur. And although one may rightly argue that I am anti-Zionist, my position is based in thoughtful and legitimate opposition to the awfully decrepit policies and politics of that pitiful, feeble, and lamentable government and its fiercely weak and leftist pacifistic status quo 80 years and counting. The anti-Semitic vlogger or podcaster, and how frightening how prevalent these are, and the number is organically growing by the day, is extremely clever and engages in the deepest form of surreptitiousness and deception. To achieve his nefarious end, he'll engage in any means necessary, and no claim true or false, or beguiling or deceitful, will stop him. He knows that such tactic will no doubt win over even those who may be on the fence vis-a-vis Israel and the Jews, or the completely ignorant, especially in today's dangerously, gullibly attentive social media audiences. And to prove it, just see the comments to these vile, spewing anti-Semitic tropes. Far worse and far more vindictive and scandalous than the vlogger or podcaster to which these comments inure. This is the height of an old Yiddish expression I still recall from youth, kosher, chazer, fiselach. To translate this term, allow me to briefly freestyle a condensed introduction to Judaism, more specifically the Torah's commandments or mitzvot, and more specifically the commandments surrounding the kosher diet. So here goes. The Torah, which was of course received by the Jewish people, by Moses, who then related it to the Jewish people about 3,500 years ago, it contains 613 commandments. Now, what must be said is that roughly 70% do not apply nowadays, because most apply with matters surrounding the temple back in the heyday, say 2,500 years ago, give or take. And so, you're left with maybe 200, of which 100 are negative commandments. So don't kill, don't steal. There's nothing active about it. No action required per se. It's simply don't do. So then you're left with 100. But even the 100 is a little more complicated than most think. There isn't 100 mitzvot that a Jew must perform every moment of every day. To be fair, a Jew that simply performs what we would call 3 positive commandments for a male, the female is slightly different. I'm not going to get into that distinction because it's beyond the purview. But in short, a male who keeps the Shabbat, which is Saturday, keep it, observe it, and keep the commandments related thereto, as well as one who, male above the age of 13, that dons the tefillin, the phylacteries, each morning for the morning prayer, and then finally consumes kosher only, is more or less a good, fine Orthodox Jew with very little more. Then there is for married couples the laws of family purity. I'm not going to go into that, of course. But in short, that is it. There is nothing more. The other, call it 90 or so mitzvot, are really cluster mitzvot. So when it comes to the holiday of Pesach, right, Passover, there's probably 5 or 10 commandments that apply to those 7 days. The same thing with the Feast of the Tabernacle or Sukkot, and so on and so forth. So it must be, I think, broken down into these, and then there's even a further distinction. The mitzvot are divided into 3 further categories, which is called edut, witness, literally translated, mishpatim, laws, chukim, statutes, and laws pertain to those that are common sense. Don't kill, don't steal, although that's a topic for another time. Not always is it common sense, as we witnessed only 80 years ago. And then edut would be witness, which basically means the mitzvot that fall into the category of, for example, Passover, Sabbath even. We wouldn't know to do that. It's not common sense. But once God kind of dictated and said, hey, you know what? I worked 6 days and I rested on the 7th. You should do. It makes sense. It's kind of logical. Passover, I liberated you from Egyptian exile, and so do X, Y, and Z. Fair enough. Then there's chukim, which are statutes, and statutes in Torahic terms are slightly different than statutes in American or secular law. They are those mitzvot that many times do not possess a reason, many times are illogical, and even on occasion illogical. To give an example of a statute would be what I'm going to drive at here primarily, kosher. Kosher dietary laws is really statute based. There's no rhyme or reason. But here's the thing, when it comes to kosher dietary laws, so there's a whole host of laws that pertain thereto. Again, it's beyond the scope for this podcast, but suffice it to say that basically you've got, let's call it meat, dairy, fish, and call it other products or condiments, okay? The most severe kosher laws apply to meat. That's by far, right? Kosher birds are simply those birds of prey are off limit, okay? Carnivorous birds, okay? That's simply the distinction or the sign, the kosher sign is non-carnivorous. Simple as that. Fish is fins and scales. But, once you do, you could just go and have a good time fishing on the lake and bring up a bunch of, carp or whitefish or, salmon and I guess saltwater. That's obviously not freshwater, although I think there may be some freshwater salmon. But in any event, I'm not a marine biologist. The point is, once you do that, it's all good to go. You cut open the fish and you throw it on the grill and that's it. Meat becomes very complex. Okay. Now, what I have to tell you is that the Torah, interestingly enough, besides giving us the sign of kosher meat, which is only 2 signs, split hoofs and chews its cud, of which there's only about 4 or 5. Interestingly enough, it would be lamb, it would be, of course, your standard cow, I guess goat, surprisingly deer falls into that. I think even giraffe does too, which is fascinating, but of course giraffe is an endangered species, so that's not, no one hunts those. But in any event, the interesting thing is, so that's basically the kosher signs, and thereafter it has to be cut in a certain way, it has to be examined in a certain way. Very complex laws pertaining to meat specifically. However, above and beyond that, Torah enumerates certain animals that are prohibited. Why? No one knows. The point is, one of those is, of course, the pig. As we know, pig is a big no-no in Judaism, right? Actually, ironically enough, in Islam as well. But it's interesting how the pig has become the big no-no in Jewish polemic. It's actually fascinating because you'd be surprised to learn that consuming a grain of macaroni on Passover is 10 times worse, without exaggeration, than consuming an entire platter of um, of pork rinds during the year. That kind of should surprise you, as you know how Jews are steer clear of any sort of pig consumption, any sort of ham or anything of that nature. But that is the case. That is the fact. So then why the pig? Why does the pig stand out as this ugly thing in Jewish history, in Jewish folklore? It's a wild thing. But that goes back to the old Yiddish saying I expressed a couple of moments ago, kosher chazer fisalech. And that is because the pig, interestingly enough, does contain, or I don't know if contain is the proper word, does possess one of the two kosher signs, which makes it even more phenomenal that it's so that it's seen as so disgusting in Jewish folklore. It does have split hooves. It does not chew its cud, but it does possess split hooves. In which case, what is so awful about it? And like I said earlier, literally consuming one slice of pasta, I mean literally a morsel of pasta on Passover, is 10 times worse than consuming an entire pig during the year, for a Jew, that is. How do you figure? It doesn't even sound right. But those are the facts. By the way, both fall into the category of statute. No rhyme or reason. But we know how severe one is versus the other based on punishment. That's how we determine. And consuming leavened on Passover is the severest of any possible punishment meted out by Torah. And consuming ham is not even close. It's simply what is referred to as a lav, the lightest form of punishment, if you will. It's punishment by flogging. But that said, so what is this big deal? The big deal is because the pig is seen as the classic deceiver and liar. And Judaism does not stand for that as a rule, as policy. It never did, it never will. It is the most detestable thing to Judaism, is beguiling and deceiving. And that's what the pig does, because it's as if the pig kicks up its front, its forelegs in the mud and filth and grime and says, look, I'm kosher, I got split hooves. And that is what Torah most detests. And therefore the pig is seen as the seminal, if you will, no-no item or consumable food in Jewish lore. And that's where the Yiddish term kosher chazer fisalech emanated, kosher pig feet, if you will. And that is what these vloggers and podcasters are, in short. Returning now to the formal podcast theme, regardless of such pathetic despots, losers, morons, and Jew haters as Dave Smith, Bassam Youssef, Douglas McGregor, Piers Morgan, newcomer Carrie Prejean, the deplorable Abby Martin, Jimmy Dore, and others, and by the way, like in defamation cases, so too in ad hominem indictments, truth is a defense. Israel rightfully belongs, has always belonged, and will always belong exclusively to the Jewish people, and no putz nor political pundit will change that. It is exclusively ours both Toratically and by physically defeating the enemy 5 times in war, all which the enemy initiated, and as the old axiom goes, all's fair in love and war. Just like any sovereign conquest, including the U.S., Britain, and dare I say, Islam. Additionally, Toradically, Israel is 3 times its current size, so I suggest you take what you undeservingly got and move on. I passionately maintain, therefore, that anti-Zionism is in fact anti-Semitism. Even if one wishes to argue otherwise, I'll give you a super-minority allowance where this is perhaps the case, but as a rule, in 90% of cases, the two are interchangeable. Anti-Zionism is only a cover, a shill, a decoy, like this pathetic, dumb Polak, literally not the start of a joke, who only days ago unfurled an Israeli flag, only instead of the Star of David, a swastika was emblazoned on an otherwise white and blue striped canvas. Watching that 30-second clip to which so many friends and colleagues reacted with utter shock and disgust, I instead reacted with, "News bulletin, dog bites man." I wasn't surprised. Why, besides not known for their sharpness of mind, the Poles are ones to talk. I suppose the more things change, the more they stay the same. The worst thing about all this is that all those bums I name above, even if legitimately staunch anti-Zionists and nothing more sinister, their audiences are overwhelmingly dummies, largely Gen Z and Alpha, who are mostly uneducated and steeped in severely crippling wokeism and foolishness, and are therefore simply not erudite enough to separate the two. And those horrible podcasters and vloggers certainly don't make any active attempt to emphasize that distinction, likely by design. These bastards are purposeful in their sinister and nefarious intent, and although they may fool some in their so-called claim of separation of the two, no doubt they are all aware that their Hitler Youth audiences are incapable, or even if capable, don't care to. They know that this is the most proficient way in which to stimulate a Holocaust. They're correct. And to those who pose what they make to be the existential question, America first or Israel first? Israel first. The only true ally of the U.S. 80 years and counting is America first. You buffoon. They remind me of those hundreds of thousands of fans across this country who at sporting events merely pay lip service by standing at attention and in contrived awe, caps removed, right hands placed on their hearts for either the anthem pregame or America the Beautiful during the 7th-inning stretch, but otherwise crap on their country in the most sadistic fashion. Now, while I'm mindful that I will take a lot of flack from friends, family, and constituents, but still never shying away from controversy, especially in dissemination of the truth, see my previous podcasts, hear this. While I don't per se subscribe to Natura Carta, certainly not to jackass Beck, Weiss, or Feldman, and state herewith in no uncertain terms that these virtual particles of scum are worse than Carlson, Candice, and Fuentes, and all anti-Semites in the world combined, and although I don't per se subscribe to Rabbi Yaakov Shapiro, whose erudition and articulation are quite honed either, merely based on sheer pragmatism, it is my most strongly held and passionate opinion that it'd be best for the 7 million of Israel's Jews to march into the Mediterranean. Belaboring the Zionist cause any further is not only counterproductive, but highly deleterious. At this point, it is simply no longer worth it. Risk-reward is no longer mathematically sound in this case. The exorbitant financial cost alone makes it untenable. Why, since October 7th, this war has cost Israel over $100 billion and is likely to at least double that by the time it is over. And it's never over. On top of the cost to Israel's treasury, how about the cost to the economy at large when schools and businesses are shuttered for weeks unending? Or even if intermittently open, fleeing into bombshells 5 times per day simply makes a normal economy infeasible. Do you realize the cost to the economy because of zero travel and tourism alone? How much more so the lives lost and bodies maimed over the past 80 years, and more particularly the past 3? The current path is simply unsustainable. Israel's Jewish population would be much better served elsewhere. Zionism and Israel have simply proven a failed experiment. See highly decorated Prussian military officer and strategist Karl Clausewitz's Vom Krieg, on War, 1832. And even though the result may be the same, I cannot emphasize enough that my position emanates from diametrically different postulates than that of the NK and its troop of useful idiots marching in the street alongside fiercely anti-Jewish, not only anti-Israel crowds, which I vehemently denounce, disclaim, and disavow. And to my colleague Yaakov Shapiro, being interviewed on the Katie Halper show, herself a Jewish Israel hater, who doesn't believe that Israel is ours even Toradically, something with which, aside perhaps from the premature issue only, you vehemently disagree, is again damaging to the Jewish, not merely Israel cause at large, and is hypocritical. You'd also be well served to study Shulchan Aruch Harav, Orach Chaim, chapter 329. And although many of you may react, how dare I endorse capitulation, as a pragmatist, I assure you it's far better than the alternative. I agree with the NK in that there's no mitzvah to die for Israel, not in exile, and certainly not in the numbers we have been. Sure, I sang a completely different song 40 years ago, but that was 40 years ago, when my main man Meir was vying for the position of prime minister, when one could still ban the media where necessary, when social media did not exist, when the world was a kinder, friendlier, saner, fairer one, when we were only 40 years from the worst catastrophic event in human history, of which majority, target, and victim was the Jewish people, and when therefore anti-Semitism was not yet mainstream. The world still cried for us some. Why, back then even Iran was a nobody, and had we nipped it in the bud then, and we had grounds even then, we'd be in a better place today. But today it is simply too late. We squandered every opportunity we had way back when, and now we are merely left to our vices. I'm exhausted and exasperated, and belaboring the matter will only exacerbate it. It's been too many years of pain and suffering. The periods of bliss and pride have been way too intermittent, and with every passing day, those periods are shrinking both in quality and quantity. The great pride I used to have in my heart for Israel is long gone. Now, when I think of that country, it seems to only engender feelings of flagellation. Now, only emotions of agony, torment, and twinge are conjured. The pride doused, the pain aroused, and those sentiments are not so much due to the enemy without as it is the enemy within. I even indirectly blame Israel for all the global anti-Semitic terrorism, but again for an entirely different reason than the lies and distortions the world has been fed for years. Why, it is on the front lines. It is the miner's canary. It is, first and foremost, the bud of the Islamic Jihad joke when radical Islam first reared its ugly head approximately 40 years ago. Had it not been so feckless, it would have put down the forebears, including Arafat, may he rot in hell, when it had multiple chances to do so. Even Begin, as good a prime minister as he was, probably the best Israel has seen, was also weak and spineless and ultimately folded like a cheap camera with the Camp David Accords in 1977 when he handed the Sinai to Sadat, for which Sadat paid the ultimate price. Just goes to show how sick and twisted the Islamic world is, and was even back then, nearly 50 years ago. The Islamic world has an uncanny knack for smelling a quislink from thousands of miles away. Israel, through decade after decade of inaction, when it could have and should have acted with impunity, allowed the bloodthirsty Muslims and their shenanigans to fester, and ultimately emboldened the global Islamic onslaught, including ISIS, ISIL, ISI, Taliban, Hezbollah, Hamas, Muslim Brotherhood, even 9/11, and the rest of the excrement unleashed by Islam upon the world, not just Jews or Israel. No winding back the clock now. I just love it, of course, sarcastically. How everyone is now celebrating the new death penalty law for convicted terrorists passed in Knesset. What a crock. First, I will assume it's an ex post facto law, which means that it will not apply to the scum that perpetrated the October 7th massacre or to any miscreant guilty of murder prior to March 30, 2026. Second, the operative term is convicted. Now, the far left Israel courts will be far more conservative, deliberate, and discretionary in its issuance of guilty of murder verdicts as a way of getting around and circumventing the death penalty. Third, I further assume that, like in the US, even one who is convicted of murder, such death penalty punishment will not be carried out for at least a decade, allowing for exhaustion of appeals and clemency ad nauseum on the Israeli tax dollar. Where was this law 80 years ago at the founding of the state, or at least 1962, when Israel carried out its first and only capital execution of Adolf Eichmann? Why not then extend similar courtesy to any murderer of a Jew, which impetus was anti-Semitism or anti-Zionism? I'll tell you why. Because, like I said earlier, Israel's government is and always has been made up of losers, quislings, and weak, pathetic, feckless shysters. Do not celebrate this newly passed law. It's a nothing burger, and way too little, way too late. Considering the above, and to bolster my position, I pose the following question to all my detractors. I suppose that includes any Zionist or even Israeli, and I acknowledge it is a trap question. If you could have Israel another 80 years, but it'll cost you 40,000 lives, you down? Either answer is a bad one, because any answer makes you either a sadist or a masochist. And please don't give me your dumb Holocaust argument. God forbid another Holocaust. Where are you fleeing? Wasn't that the problem in 1940 Europe before the formation of a Jewish state? My response is, you fool. Where did the worst Holocaust since the Holocaust happen? Familiar with the old proverb, the shoemaker's kids go barefoot? What sick irony. Don't give me that Holocaust scare tactic gobbledygook. The other day, a YouTube video caught my eye. It was a 1973-74 video of Israel's most decorated folk singer, Yehoram Gaon, in his signature style, mellifluously singing the highly celebrated 1973 Yom Kippur War-inspired song that goes something like this. אני מבטיח לך, ילדה שלי קטנה, שזאת תהיה המלחמה האחרונה. I guarantee you, my little girl, that this war will be the last and final one. And I wept. Again, I wish to be clear, unlike most others, like the ones named above, whose argument is based on twisted so-called logic and principle, mine is based on deliberately calculated pragmatism. To this end, my late father always taught me, you could be so right, you're dead right. Double entendre. Why, after we're done with Iran, there'll be another and yet another, and we're still not done with Gaza or the Shomron or southern Lebanon. And at any point, Syria, Egypt, Jordan, Turkey, and others can and will likely rear their ugly heads. There's no endgame in sight. Bury the hatchet now and save yourselves. Too much damn Jewish bloodshed, and you'll never stop bloodthirsty goyim. And yes, Candace, I did use that term derogatory, because that's exactly what you and your ilk are. Seeing as I'm completing and uploading this podcast on the heels of Passover 2026, let us hope and pray that Ki Meitzeischa Meretz Mitzrayim Arenu Niflaot. Just as 3,500 years ago we witnessed phenomenal miracles during our mass exodus and liberation from Egypt, so too shall we experience similar miracles here and now, and finally merit the ultimate miracle in blending redemption with the coming of Mashiach speedily.